In this video, I want to share with you the meaning of anatomical xenarthry, and I'm going to do that by contrasting the vertebral anatomy present in a rodent, which exhibits a fairly typical mammalian anatomy, at least in terms of the intervertebral articulations. This is a Hydromys chrysogaster specimen, and I'm going to contrast that with a xenarthran. The name xenarthran comes, of course, from the vertebral anatomy, but it's also a clade. It means the group containing sloths, armadillos, and anteaters. And this is an extant armadillo, a Dayspus novum cinctus, and I want to credit the University of Michigan and Cody Thompson for uploading their CT scan of this particular armadillo specimen to morphosaurus.org and letting me use it. So let's start with the rodent CT scan. I'm going to zoom in on what I expect is fairly obvious now. This is the backbone, that's the sacrum that I'm circling there, and these are the lumbar vertebrae, and you can see where the thoracic start up there. And if you look up close at one of these lumbar vertebrae, you can see, I'll point out two major intervertebral articulations, and the first is between the zygopophyses. So here's a zygopophysis of one of the lumbars that is sort of slotting into an articular facet just ventral to it on the next posterior lumbar vertebrae. And that's pretty much consistent all the way up and down the vertebral column. And now I'm going to rotate so you can see these intervertebral articulations ventrally. And that shows you the other major intervertebral articulation, which is, of course, between the vertebral centra themselves. So there's one right there. There's one right there. The armadillo, in contrast to the rodent, exhibits anatomical xenarthry. And let me zoom in and show you exactly what that means. You can see here, at first glance, a very similar kind of intervertebral articulation concerning the zygopophyses as what you saw in the rodent. So here's a more anterior zygopophysis articulating dorsal to its posterior neighbor, and that's not unlike what is going on in the rodent and in most other mammals. But if we look more closely at this armadillo, typifying anatomical xenarthry, that articulation extends also ventral, right? So you have a facet dorsally on the anterior vertebrae in this case, and you have an articulation ventrally, so that the posterior facet, or the facet of the more posterior vertebrae, fits in to this kind of notch here, and that is the meaning of anatomical xenarthry. Now, you may have noticed here that these various elements of each vertebrae are not fully fused, and that's, of course, another big difference, but it has nothing to do with the xenarthry per se. This is just a immature individual that doesn't have all of its bones fully ossified. And so you can see here as well that the centra are not fully ossified with their respective neural arches, and of course this is a CT scan, and the soft tissues and the intervertebral discs are not rendered in this particular volume, but they would be there, and this is a not unusual intervertebral articulation. So the real important aspect of anatomical xenarthry concerns this sort of notch that you get on the zygopophyses, with the posterior vertebrae slotting into between a dorsal and a ventral articular facet. And this is not necessarily throughout the entire vertebral column. In all xenarthrans and all living xenarthrans, you tend to get xenarthry for at least a few of these lumbars. And in armadillos, it extends fairly far up the vertebral column, but it does peter out. The closer you get to the head and neck, the less prominent it becomes.